The morning sun cut through the thin mountain air of Comuna 13, casting long shadows across the newly constructed concrete steps that zigzagged up the hillside like a gray ribbon of hope. It was March 15th, 1984, and the people of Medellin's most forgotten barrio had gathered for what the city officials called an infrastructure inauguration ceremony. The smell of fresh concrete mixed with the aroma of empanadas and coffee from street vendors who had positioned themselves along the event perimeter, understanding that this was more than just another bureaucratic ribbon cutting. Children in their cleanest clothes clutched small Colombian flags that someone had distributed, while their mothers wore their Sunday dresses despite the weekday schedule, treating this moment with the solemnity usually reserved for religious festivals. But as the crowd of nearly 3,000 residents pressed against the police barriers, their chants told a different story. Pablo, Pablo, Pablo. The name echoed off the surrounding brick houses and tin roofs with rhythmic intensity that seemed to pulse with the mountain's heartbeat, drowning out the prepared speeches of Mayor William Jaramillo and the regional development minister who had traveled from Bogotá for this moment. The officials on the makeshift platform shifted uncomfortably, their formal suits and ties marking them as outsiders in this landscape, where laundry hung from windows like prayer flags, and where running water was still cause for celebration. If you lived through the 1980s in Colombia, you remember how hope felt like a luxury that poor neighborhoods couldn't afford, until one man changed everything. Standing behind the red ribbon that stretched across the top step, Pablo Escobar appeared almost uncomfortable with the adulation, his hands clasped behind his back, wearing a simple white guayabera that had become his signature look during these public appearances. At 35, his face had filled out from his younger criminal days, and the carefully trimmed mustache gave him an air of respectability that newspaper photographers captured from every angle. The weight he had gained came not from indolence, but from the stress and satisfaction of legitimate enterprise. The long hours spent reviewing construction plans, the business dinners with municipal contractors, the countless community meetings where residents presented him with problems that required immediate attention and substantial resources to solve. But it was his eyes that held the crowd's attention. Dark, calculating, yet somehow warm when they swept across the faces of the children who had been pushed to the front by their mothers, eager to see the man who had built their stairway to the world above. Those same eyes that had once assessed threats and opportunities in Medellin's underground economy now evaluated voter loyalty and political potential with equal precision. He had learned to read crowds the way he once read rivals, understanding that genuine affection could be as valuable as fear and infinitely more sustainable in the long term. The irony was not lost on anyone present, least of all Pablo himself. While Mayor Jaramillo fumbled with the oversized scissors and spoke in bureaucratic platitudes about urban development initiatives and public-private partnerships, every person in that crowd knew who had really made this moment possible. Pablo's construction company, Construcciones Escobar, had not only built these 384 concrete steps that connected Comuna 13 to the city's transportation grid, but had done it in 4 months, a project the municipal government had been promising for over a decade. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Where government had offered excuses, Pablo had delivered results. Where politicians had provided speeches, Pablo had provided stairs. As the ribbon fell and the crowd surged forward, Pablo found himself separated from the official delegation, swept up by residents who wanted to shake his hand, embrace him, or simply touch the man who had transformed their daily reality. Each interaction was a small political moment, carefully observed by the campaign advisors he had begun assembling, who understood that authentic human connection could not be manufactured or scripted. Doña Maria, a 67-year-old woman who ran a small tienda at the bottom of the hill, grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Her hands bore the calluses of decades spent washing other people's clothes and cooking in kitchens where every peso mattered. Mijo, before your stairs, it took me 40 minutes to climb to my daughter's house. Now it takes 8. You gave me back 20 years of my life. Her weathered face was streaked with tears, and Pablo felt something twist in his chest, a mixture of pride and something else he couldn't quite name. Power, perhaps, or responsibility, or the dangerous intoxication that comes from being genuinely needed by people who have been forgotten by everyone else. 3 weeks after the Comuna 13 inauguration, Pablo sat in the back room of La Macarena, a restaurant in the upscale El Poblado neighborhood where the city's power brokers gathered for late lunches and quiet conversations. The restaurant's owner, Alfonso, had learned to see nothing and remember less, ensuring that certain tables remained occupied by the same patrons for hours at a time, protected by the ambient noise of clinking silverware and soft conversation that shaped Antioquia's unofficial governance. The walls were decorated with photographs of illustrious clientele, senators, governors, business leaders, and occasional visiting dignitaries from Bogotá, a visual reminder of the circles where real decisions were made. Across from him sat Jairo Ortega, a veteran of Liberal Party politics, whose silver hair and expensive suit marked him as a survivor of Colombia's treacherous political landscape. Ortega's hands showed the soft pallor of someone who had never worked with them, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man who had navigated 3 decades of Colombian politics without ever being touched by scandal or violence. He had been watching Pablo's growing influence in the city's marginal neighborhoods, and what he saw was an opportunity that the traditional political machinery had been unable to create through all their patronage networks and carefully orchestrated favors. "You have something that money can't buy," Ortega said, cutting into his bandeja paisa while speaking in the measured tones of a man accustomed to delicate negotiations. The restaurant's signature dish, beans, rice, ground beef, chorizo, chicharrón, fried plantain, arepa, and avocado, represented abundance that most Colombians could afford only rarely, making it a perfect symbol of the gap between political elites and the people they claim to represent. Genuine popular support, not the kind that comes from promises or patronage, but from actually delivering results. Do you understand how rare that is in Colombian politics? Pablo sipped his aguardiente slowly, the anise-flavored liquor burning slightly as it went down, letting Ortega continue his pitch while his own mind raced through the implications. Politics had always been a tool for him, something to be influenced through money or pressure when it interfered with business. But Ortega was suggesting something different. Politics as a platform, a stage from which to project power openly rather than from the shadows. The older man's proposal carried risks that Pablo was already calculating. Exposure to scrutiny, the need to account for sources of funding, the possibility that enemies might use official channels to attack him in ways they had never dared attempt through street violence. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Carlos Later, Pablo's occasional associate in more dubious enterprises, whose presence in this respectable establishment caused several patrons to glance nervously in their direction and then studiously return their attention to their meals. Later possessed the manic energy of someone perpetually under the influence of his own product. But he had channeled that energy into political ambitions, having recently won a seat in the regional assembly through a combination of populist rhetoric and carefully distributed cocaine profits. His success had proven that the boundary between criminal enterprise and legitimate politics was more porous than most people wanted to acknowledge. "Politics is just another business, Pablo," later said, with the confident grin of someone who had already successfully made the transition, settling into his chair without waiting for an invitation. "The difference is, in politics, they pay you to be corrupt. It's all legal. You want to move money around? Create a foundation. You want to reward your friends? Give them government contracts. You want to punish your enemies? Use the regulatory apparatus." His laugh carried a note of genuine amusement at the absurdity of it all. "The only real difference between what we do and what they do is paperwork." But Ortega's proposal was more sophisticated than Later's crude approach. He spoke of legitimate power, of using Pablo's proven ability to improve people's lives as a foundation for broader influence. His vision encompassed not just individual enrichment, but genuine transformation of Colombian society, albeit along lines that would benefit Pablo's interests. Think about what you could accomplish with official authority behind your projects. No more waiting for permits. No more bureaucratic delays. You could transform not just neighborhoods, but entire regions. The older man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Liberal Party needs fresh faces for the upcoming congressional elections. Faces that represent real change, not just the same families that have been recycling power for generations. Faces that can connect with voters who have given up on the political system entirely." As they spoke, Pablo's mind wandered to the dozens of construction projects his company was managing across Medellin's periphery. Housing complexes in Nueva Villa de Aburrá, where families who had lived in cardboard shacks now had concrete homes with running water and electricity. The football fields in Moravia, where teenagers who might otherwise have joined criminal gangs now gathered for organized tournaments that Pablo's company sponsored. The medical clinic in San Javier, where his money had bought equipment that the government health system couldn't afford. Each project was a thread in a web of loyalty and gratitude that stretched across the city's poorest sectors. By June 1984, the transformation was evident to anyone who knew how to look. What had once been a construction company with social projects attached had become something resembling a political machine, though Pablo was careful never to use that term in public, preferring to speak of community coordination and civic engagement. The offices of Construcciones Escobar, housed in a modest building in the Las Palmas neighborhood, buzzed with activity that went far beyond architectural plans and material contracts. The building itself had been chosen strategically, close enough to the city center to project legitimacy, but located in a middle-class neighborhood where Pablo's presence would not seem out of place or threatening to potential supporters from different economic backgrounds. In conference rooms, where engineering blueprints once dominated the walls, electoral maps now shared space with demographic studies and voter registration lists. The maps were marked with different colored pins, red for neighborhoods where Pablo's construction projects had created strong loyalty, yellow for areas where his influence was growing but not yet secure, and green for middle-class districts where his message of efficient governance and social responsibility might resonate with voters frustrated by traditional politicians' empty promises. Each pin represented not just potential votes, but specific families whose lives had been touched by Pablo's work, creating a database of political capital that traditional campaigns could never hope to duplicate. The genius of Pablo's approach lay in its organic nature. He didn't need to create a campaign organization from scratch. He simply repurposed the network he had already built through years of community engagement, adding political functions to relationships that were already based on mutual benefit and genuine affection. Eduardo El Flaco Martinez, who had managed construction crews for Pablo's housing projects, now coordinated neighborhood assemblies where residents discussed not just local infrastructure needs, but broader questions of political representation and social justice. Eduardo's transformation was particularly striking. The man who had once worried only about construction schedules and material deliveries now spoke confidently about voter turnout models and demographic targeting. His natural leadership abilities finding new expression in the political arena. The trucks that had carried cement and rebar to construction sites now carried folding chairs and portable sound systems to community meetings, their commercial logos providing a subtle reminder of the practical achievements that gave Pablo's political message its credibility. The meetings followed a careful formula. Begin with reports on ongoing construction projects. Move to discussion of community needs that might be addressed through political action, and conclude with practical information about voter registration and election procedures. The foreman, who had supervised the building of stairways and schools, now supervised the registration of new voters and the distribution of campaign literature, bringing the same attention to detail and results-oriented thinking that had made Pablo's construction projects so successful. These men understood the neighborhoods in ways that traditional political organizers never could. They knew which families needed help with medical bills, which teenagers were at risk of dropping out of school, which elderly residents struggled to navigate bureaucratic systems that seemed designed to exclude them. This knowledge became the foundation of a political operation that was as much about solving immediate problems as it was about winning votes. Maria Elena Cordoba, a social worker who had helped Pablo identify the most urgent needs in each neighborhood, found herself managing what amounted to a shadow social services department. Her files contained detailed information on thousands of families who needed medical care, whose children required school supplies, which elderly residents struggled to pay for basic utilities. These files, maintained with the precision of a government database, but without the bureaucratic delays that characterized official services, represented a level of knowledge about constituent needs that few elected officials ever achieved. This information had always guided Pablo's charitable activities, but now it served a dual purpose, creating a database of beneficiaries who understood exactly who was responsible for the improvements in their lives, and who might be expected to remember that debt when election day arrived. The weekly meetings at the Construcciones Escobar offices took on the rhythm of campaign planning sessions, though Pablo insisted on maintaining the fiction that they were simply community coordination meetings. Around a conference table that still bore the rings from countless cups of tinto, the Colombian coffee that fueled these discussions, Pablo's core team would review progress reports from different barrios. Comuna 13 is solid, Eduardo would report, checking items off his handwritten list. The stairway project has them completely committed. They're talking about putting up a plaque with your name. San Javier is coming along, Maria Elena would add. The new medical clinic opened last month, and they've treated over 200 patients already. The mothers are organizing themselves into support committees. But it was the transformation of Pablo himself that proved most striking. The man who had once preferred to operate from the shadows, whose business success depended on anonymity and deniability, began to embrace public visibility with the calculated precision of a seasoned politician. His appearances at community events became more frequent and more polished. The improvised speeches of his early charitable activities gave way to carefully prepared remarks that touched on themes of social justice, economic opportunity, and national sovereignty. He hired a speech coach, a dignified woman named Carmen Villarreal, who had worked with senators and governors to help him project the gravitas that political success required. The first serious attack came through the pages of El Colombiano, Medellin's most influential newspaper, in a series of investigative articles that began appearing in August 1984. The initial piece, written by veteran journalist Alfonso Cano, bore the headline, "The Mysterious Millions of Medellin's Builder." It was a masterpiece of insinuation, carefully skirting legal boundaries while raising uncomfortable questions about the source of Pablo's seemingly unlimited resources for community projects. While municipal budgets for social programs have remained stagnant for the past 3 years, Cano wrote, private businessman Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria has managed to fund construction projects valued at over 30 million pesos. This extraordinary generosity raises obvious questions about the origins of such wealth, particularly given Escobar's minimal formal education and lack of previous business experience in the construction sector. The article went on to catalog Pablo's projects in exhaustive detail, transforming what had been seen as admirable philanthropy into something that appeared suspiciously like money laundering. The timing of the newspaper campaign was not coincidental. Traditional political families in Antioquia had watched Pablo's growing influence with increasing alarm, recognizing a threat to the established order that had sustained their power for generations. The Echevarria family, whose textile fortune had dominated Medellin's economy for decades, saw Pablo's popularity among the working class as a direct challenge to their traditional base of support. The Santos clan, whose newspaper empire had shaped public opinion throughout Colombia, viewed Pablo's media-savvy approach to politics as an invasion of their territory by an unwelcome outsider. The response from Pablo's team was swift and sophisticated, revealing how much they had learned about modern political warfare. Instead of denying the questions raised by El Colombiano, Pablo's newly hired communications director, a sharp young woman named Patricia Lozano, who had studied journalism at the Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana, encouraged him to address them head-on. "We're not hiding anything," she advised during a strategy meeting in Pablo's office, where the walls were now decorated with framed photographs from construction site ceremonies rather than architectural awards. "We're proud of what we've accomplished, and we want to talk about it." The centerpiece of their counterattack was a carefully orchestrated press conference held at the construction site of a new elementary school in the Castilla neighborhood. Standing before a backdrop of concrete mixers and workers in hard hats, Pablo delivered what would later be remembered as one of the most effective political speeches of the 1984 election cycle. "They ask where my money comes from," he said. his voice carrying easily across the construction site thanks to a sound system that Maria Elena had borrowed from a local parish. I'll tell you where it comes from. It comes from the sweat of honest workers who believe in building something better for their children. It comes from profits earned through legitimate business, invested back into the communities that made that success possible. Election day arrived with the pre-dawn drizzle that often blessed Medellin in early October, turning the city's brick streets slick and reflective under the streetlights. By 6 a.m., long lines had formed outside polling stations throughout the metropolitan area, but nowhere were the crowds more energetic than in the neighborhoods where Pablo's construction projects had transformed daily life. In Comuna 13, voters began gathering at the Escuela José María Vélez polling station at 5:30 a.m., a full hour before the polls opened, many carrying folding chairs and thermoses of coffee as if preparing for a festival rather than an election. Pablo spent election morning visiting polling sites throughout his district, accompanied by Patricia Lozano and a small group of campaign volunteers who had become something like a traveling family over the months of campaigning. At each stop, the response was the same: spontaneous applause from voters waiting in line, embraces from elderly women who wanted to thank him personally for the medical clinic or the housing project or the football field that had touched their lives. "This is what democracy looks like," Pablo murmured to Patricia as they watched a group of construction workers from one of his housing projects proudly displaying their ink-stained thumbs after casting their ballots. But it was at the campaign headquarters, established in a rented storefront in the Las Palmas neighborhood, that the true drama of the day played out. By 3 p.m., with voting still in progress, Eduardo and his team of volunteer coordinators had established a sophisticated system for monitoring returns from key precincts. Using a network of observers who had been positioned at polling stations throughout the district, they received regular updates via radio communications that Eduardo plotted on a large map of Medellin that covered most of one wall. Comuna 13 reporting, crackled a voice through the radio static. 87% for Pablo. A cheer went up from the volunteers gathered around folding tables covered with voting tallies and empty coffee cups. San Javier coming in, came another report 20 minutes later. 91%. The pattern was consistent across every neighborhood where Pablo's construction projects had made their mark. Overwhelming support that translated into vote totals unlike anything the political professionals had seen in recent memory. As the official results began arriving from the electoral authority late in the evening, it became clear that Pablo had not simply won election to the House of Representatives. He had achieved something approaching a landslide. With 78% of the vote in his district, he had defeated not only the traditional Liberal Party establishment candidate, but had done so by a margin that sent shockwaves through Colombia's political class. The victory celebration at campaign headquarters lasted until sunrise, with Pablo's supporters streaming in from neighborhoods across the city to share in the triumph of a man they saw as one of their own. Standing on a makeshift stage, constructed from construction materials borrowed from a nearby project site, Pablo delivered his victory speech to a crowd that spilled out of the campaign headquarters and onto the street outside. "Tonight is not about one man winning an election," he said, his voice carrying over the cheers and the sound of fireworks that had begun exploding in the distance. "Tonight is about a movement that believes ordinary people deserve extraordinary lives. Tonight is about proving that in Colombia, change is not just possible, it's inevitable." The photograph that appeared on the front page of every major newspaper in Colombia the following morning captured a moment that seemed to crystallize the transformation that had taken Pablo Escobar from construction boss to congressman-elect. Standing on the steps of the Capitolio Nacional in Bogotá, where he would soon take his oath of office, Pablo wore a dark business suit that emphasized the respectability he had cultivated throughout his campaign. His hand rested on a leather portfolio containing the policy proposals that his team had spent months developing. Legislation addressing housing shortages, infrastructure investment, and social services for Colombia's growing urban population. But it was his expression that told the deeper story. Gone was the uncertain smile of the man who had once seemed surprised by his own popularity at community events. In its place was the confident gaze of someone who had discovered that legitimate power could be even more intoxicating than the hidden influence he had wielded from the shadows. As he climbed the marble steps toward the chamber, where he would soon occupy a seat among Colombia's most powerful politicians, Pablo carried with him the hopes of thousands of families whose lives he had genuinely improved, and the dreams of thousands more who believed he represented their path to a better future. The irony was profound and troubling in ways that few observers fully appreciated at the time. Pablo Escobar had achieved something that none of his criminal associates had ever managed. He had found a way to transform illegal profits into legitimate political power without ever explicitly acknowledging the connection between the two. His construction empire was real, his social projects were genuine, and his popular support was authentic. But underlying it all was the uncomfortable reality that his initial capital had come from enterprises that remained carefully hidden from public view. As he prepared to enter Colombia's Congress, Pablo faced a choice that would define not only his own future, but potentially the future of his country in this alternate timeline. He could use his new position to further legitimize his empire, gradually separating his legal enterprises from any remaining illegal activities until he emerged as a completely clean politician whose past remained buried. Or he could use his political platform to protect and expand the criminal enterprises that had made everything else possible, transforming the Colombian state into a partner in his broader ambitions. Standing in the doorway of the congressional chamber on his first day in office, Pablo Escobar paused for a moment to savor the weight of the moment. Behind him lay a path from the slums of Medellin to the heights of legitimate power. Ahead lay choices that would determine whether his alternative empire would become a model of redemption or a cautionary tale about the corruption of democratic institutions. In this timeline, where cocaine cartels competed with guerrilla armies and government forces for control of Colombia's future, Pablo had found a fourth path, one that led through the ballot box rather than the barrel of a gun. Whether that path would lead to salvation or damnation remained to be written.